Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Stones River, The Turning Point of the Civil War, by Wilson J. Vance. Chapter 6, the 2nd of January, 1863.
For the greater part of the next day, the two armies merely rested on their arms. With food and rest, the feeling of confidence, which had been somewhat shaken in the Union Army, began to revive, and the soldiers exhibited a cheerful tone. The Confederate forces, however, showed a contrary spirit. There was deep chagrin in all ranks, because the work that had been so bravely begun was not resumed and carried to a triumphant end. While criticisms of the general commanding began to be exchanged with freedom among the officers highest in rank. There is no doubt that this gossip reached Bragg's ears and that he was stung to the quick by it. It is possible, too, that it led him to order the movement that resulted in the final scene of the battle. During his repeated examinations of the field, Bragg had noticed the Union detachment that had been thrown across the river in Breckinridge's front, and he now determined to dislodge it. In his official reports, he lets it be understood that he merely wanted to drive away a force that was posted in an advantageous position for observation, and that might, if reinforced, be able to make a dangerous attack upon his army, for it could enfilade his whole line. But if dislodgement were all that was intended, it is hard to understand why Bragg should have organized such a heavy column for a slight task. It may well be suspected that the Confederate commander saw an opportunity to crush the Union left and, in the confusion necessarily ensuing, to drive the whole Federal army from the field en route. Bragg gave to Breckinridge 10,000 of his best fighting men, including 2,000 cavalry and ample supports of artillery. At the head of this formidable column, Breckinridge descended upon the Union troops in his immediate front at 4 p.m., January 2nd. The blow fell with the swiftness and force of a hurricane. Both Van Cleve's division and Gross's brigade had lost heavily in the previous fighting, and their ranks were too thin to offer effectual resistance. A few volleys of musketry and a few rounds of artillery were fired, and then they broke and fled to the ford, closely pursued by the yelling Confederate host. By a singular chance, not a single Union general officer was near this part of the field at the time. They were, in fact, around the center and right, against which Bragg, as a ruse, had opened a heavy artillery fire. The brigade nearest the ford was under the command of John F. Miller, a young Indiana colonel who had not yet received his stars. It was apparent to him that Breckinridge's charge, unless checked, would result disastrously to the army, and he broached the subject of a countercharge to an officer of like grade of another brigade. He was assured of support. Miller sent an orderly to find some general officer to authorize the movement and drew up his men in readiness. He had barely 1,500 with which he might hope to check 10,000, flushed with victory. In a few moments the crisis was at hand, and Miller was still awaiting orders. His brigade opened ranks to let through the fugitives, and then Miller, placing himself at the head of his men, spurred his horse into the water. He was in midstream when the orderly returned with the news that General Palmer, the only general officer to be found, had forbidden the movement. "It is too late now," replied Miller, and drawing his sword, he gave the order to charge. The very audacity of this step was its success. It is probable that the Confederates believed Miller to be leading an overwhelming force, for they stopped, fired a few shots, and then began to retreat. With fixed bayonets, Miller's men pursued, and now, with quick perception of the opportunity, other Union commands joined in the charge. Perhaps a half-mile had been traversed when the Confederates showed signs of rallying, but as their lines were halted and rearranged, the missiles of death from 100 cannon, drawn hastily together by Major Mendenhall, Crittenden's chief of artillery, and posted on a hill which commanded the whole field, suddenly fell among them. They fled again, leaving on the ground 2,000 dead and wounded, the fruit of an action of less than an hour. This ended the Battle of Stones River. For another 24 hours, the two armies confronted each other with no fight of importance. During the night of January 3rd, Bragg retreated unmolested. He reported having received information that Rosecrans was being reinforced, But in this again, he may be suspected of a euphemism. As a matter of fact, the retreat had been advised at a council of his principal generals, two of whom, Withers and Cheatham, united in the blunt statement over their own signatures that he had only 3 reliable divisions left, and that these were, to a certain extent, demoralized. Most of his officers also assured him, with equal frankness, that he ought to give up the command of the army, advice that he did not heed, and Polk, for writing to this effect to the Confederate president, was placed under arrest, but he was afterward released.
Chapter 7. What Might Have Been and What Was.
The Battle of Stones River produced profound disappointment both in the North and in the South. Claimed as a victory by both sides, the first fruits fell to the Army of the Cumberland, which had not only held the field, but had compelled the retirement of its adversary and the relinquishment by the latter of strategic positions and domination over considerable areas. But as the weeks passed, without developments of other striking results, the Northern people felt that the victory had been little more than technical, and that the battle was another of the practically indecisive contests so frequent at that period. On the other hand, the Southern people were mortified and chagrined at a defeat suffered when their cause was prospering in almost all other quarters. They were not more given to analyzing strategic and tactical features than their Northern enemies, but they were able to realize that their Second Army, in size and importance, had lost thousands of soldiers, and that it has been driven out of Middle Tennessee and away from the vicinity of the state capital, the recovery of which had always been a cherished object of their hearts. The opposition to Bragg, both in and out of the Army of the Tennessee, became intensified from the time the retirement from Murfreesboro was ordered. It was perhaps natural that the outcome was thus viewed in the two sections, for it is in the light of what it might have been, rather than what it was, that Stones River must be judged. Union victory upon that field did not, it is true, reveal results of transcendent importance, but Confederate victory, at one time so near, would have been followed by the weightiest and most far-reaching consequences. Had Bragg been able to drive his infantry across the Nashville Pike on the last day of 1862, or had he been able to crush the Union left on the 2nd of January 1863, the capture or destruction, whole or partial, of his enemy would have been one of the least of these consequences, for the way to the Ohio would then have been open, and Cincinnati and other opulent northern cities would have been at the mercy of Confederate arms. Vicksburg would not have been an historic name, for overwhelming forces could have been turned against Grant to crush him or drive him from Mississippi. Tennessee, second state in population below Mason and Dixon's line, and first in such food as armies consume, would have been held to furnish the vital recruits and supplies to the Confederacy. East Tennessee would have waited in vain for the relieving Northern forces. Kentucky and Missouri might have been wrested from Union control, and Arkansas freed from the presence of the invader. Finally, Europe's recognition, with the manifold complexities for the North that must have ensued therefrom, could have been no longer logically denied to the Richmond government. After Stones River, Bragg's battered battalions retired 30 to 40 miles away to the line of Duck Diver, and there maintained an attitude of defiance for 6 months. It took that period for Rosecrans to restore the ravages of battle in his army. Wheeler, Morgan, and Forrest, the cavalry chieftains, meanwhile, kept up a series of raids upon Rosecrans's long line of communications, raids that sorely tried that commander, pestered as he was by constant injunctions from Washington to move forward. But in June 1863, having at length accumulated sufficient supplies, the Army of the Cumberland started the campaign that was to drive the Army of the Tennessee out of the state from which it took its name. Then came another halt, but in September the Union forces again advanced, and the Confederates again retired. At Chickamauga, the Army of the Tennessee, reinforced by Longstreet and Buckner, turned, and inflicting a bloody defeat upon the Army of the Cumberland, locked it up in the fastness of Chattanooga. But Bragg was unable to gather substantial fruits from his victory. At Missionary Ridge in December, The Army of the Cumberland led in the movement that broke the battlefront of its historic adversary. Thenceforth, the Army of the Tennessee, fighting bravely at every turn, was obliged by the weight of opposing numbers to retire further and further into the South. At Resaca, at Dalton, at Kennesaw Mountain, at Atlanta, and at a score of other places, it showed the qualities of valor and endurance that had already won it deserved renown. But it never looked to the North again until the latter days of 1864, when Hood summoned it for its last great adventure, that desperate leap past Sherman, which was to end in utter rout before the ramparts of Nashville. The Army of the Cumberland lost in the Stones River Campaign 1,730 killed, 7,802 wounded, 3,717 captured and missing, a total of 13,249. The Army of the Tennessee lost 1,294 killed, 7,945 wounded, 1,027 captured or missing, a total of 10,266.
This concludes Stones River, The Turning Point of the Civil War, by Wilson J. Vance. We hope you've enjoyed this volume. For more military history audiobooks, visit Intonio.net and subscribe to Major Intonio's YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.